Chicago, January 1905. The snow lay in hard ridges along the streets, blackened by soot from the stockyards. In a cramped boarding house on West Chicago Avenue, the landlady opened a bedroom door and froze. The room smelled of sickness and laudanum. A woman, her tenant, recently married, lay stiff on the bed, her skin waxen, her mouth locked in a grimace of pain. Her new husband was gone. In the drawer beside her body, police would later find a folded marriage license, still damp with ink. The name of the groom, John Schmidt. But in other towns, he had been Henry Bartels, Jacob Huff, Joseph Hoch. He was many men, and yet he was only one. A man newspapers would soon call the Chicago Bluebeard. The whispers started immediately. She had been healthy days before. Why did she die so suddenly, retching and choking as if her very insides were burning? Why had her husband vanished with her savings the night before her death? And why did the same story, different names? Different towns seemed to echo across the Midwest like a curse. The police now faced a chilling question. How many women had this man really married? How many had he buried? And how do you catch a killer who wears a new name each time he says, "I do"? The scream came just before dawn. On the 3rd of January, 1905, in a modest boarding house on West Chicago Avenue, the landlady, Mrs. Fisher, was roused from sleep by a sound she would never forget. A woman gasping for air. A kind of choking rattle that did not belong in any healthy throat. She hurried to the upstairs room, her candle trembling as she pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Not the ordinary odors of coal smoke and cooked cabbage that clung to most rooms in the district, but something acrid, metallic like matches burned to ash. On the bed lay a woman, her skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, her mouth twisted mid-cry. She was still, already cooling. Her name was Marie Walker. She was 32, a widow who had remarried barely weeks earlier. Her new husband had introduced himself as John Schmidt, a respectable German businessman. He had seemed polite, dependable, even generous. He had given Marie gifts, promised her security, and convinced her to marry in haste. But now Marie was dead, and Schmidt was gone. The neighbors would later tell police that they had seen him the night before, carrying a satchel down the stairs with brisk purpose. He told the landlady Marie was ill and he was fetching medicine. He never returned. By morning, the only trace of him was the marriage license left in the drawer of the bedside table. The ink was still fresh, the paper stiff and unsmudged. On the dresser, Mrs. Fisher noticed something else. An empty glass with a milky film clinging to its rim. She touched it, sniffed, recoiled. It carried the same strange tang that hung in the air. The doctor who arrived later wrote acute gastritis on the death certificate. It was the safe answer, the routine answer. In a city plagued by poor sanitation, spoiled food and cholera, Zoch deaths were ordinary. But the neighbors did not believe it. They had watched Marie walk the street in good health just days before, cheeks bright against the winter cold. They whispered, "She was poisoned." When police took statements, Mrs. Fisher gave them the name John Schmidt. But she added something odd. The man had once signed her guest book differently, Henry Bartels, and a neighbor recalled he had been introduced to church as Joseph Hoch. The detective scribbled the aliases down, but the ink barely dried before another report landed on his desk. In Milwaukee, Just weeks earlier, a woman had died under the same circumstances. She too had married a man named Schmidt. She too had fallen violently ill within days. And her husband, too, had vanished with her savings. A pattern was forming, though the edges were still jagged. How many wives had this man taken? How many coffins bore his silent signature? The newspapers caught the scent almost immediately. The Chicago Tribune ran a story under the headline, "Wife dies suddenly. Husband vanishes." They described him as a German of middle age, average build, with a heavy mustache and an accent. Ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. And that was the horror. He looked like every other man on the streetcar. The editors reached for a name to crystallize the dread. They borrowed from an old French folktale, Bluebeard, the man who murdered his wives and hid them in locked rooms. And so, in bold print, Chicago met its new monster, the Chicago Bluebeard. The name spread like frost. Women who read matrimonial ads in the morning paper shivered over their tea. Landladies eyed their tenants with suspicion. Police stations across Illinois and Wisconsin received letters from families describing eerily similar stories. A stranger, a marriage, a Sudengrau. Detectives now faced a terrifying possibility. Marie Walker was not the first, and she would not be the last. And the man they were chasing was not just a swindler. He was a killer who collected wives like trophies, each one ending in the same silence. As the city braced itself, the question loomed: how do you stop a murderer who changes his name as easily as his suit? Who vanishes between states before the dirt settles on a coffin? She had kept his letters tied with ribbon on a wooden desk in her small rented room on Chicago Avenue. Marie Walker stored them in a drawer beside her Bible and a silver brooch left from her first marriage. The paper was cheap, the ink uneven, but the words shimmered with hope. Dearest Marie, I am a man of steady habits, seeking only companionship and a home. I am alone in this world, as I know you are. Why should we suffer separately, when together we could live in comfort? Marie read these lines at night, after long days sewing in a department store workshop where the air reeked of steam and sweat. Her fingers were raw from pulling thread through stiff fabric. Her back ached, and her pay barely covered rent. At 32, a widow with no children, she felt the weight of society's pity. People spoke of her with a certain tone. Respectable. Yes, but incomplete. When she answered the advertisement in the Chicago Daily News, it was not desperation that guided her, but yearning for warmth, for safety, for a partner who would soften the sharp edges of the city. She wanted to believe John Schmidt was who he claimed to be. He arrived in December, bowler hat in hand, mustache neatly trimmed. He was not handsome, not striking, but that reassured her. There was steadiness in his manner, a kind of practiced calm. He praised her cooking, complimented her sewing, and spoke of business ventures in Milwaukee. He promised her that she would not have to work herself to exhaustion forever. Marie's friends noticed how quickly the courtship moved. Within days, he proposed, pressing her hand gently as though fate had already written their union. She blushed when she admitted it, embarrassed at her own eagerness. But his conviction was intoxicating. The wedding was small, witnessed only by a neighbor and the landlady. But Marie glowed with quiet pride. For a brief moment, her life shifted. She no longer dreaded the empty hours after work. She had someone waiting at home, someone who called her his beloved wife. She imagined moving to Milwaukee, perhaps buying a house with lace curtains and a small garden. She imagined stability, something that had eluded her since her first husband's death. But beneath that dream, shadows lurked. Neighbors whispered that Schmidt was too insistent about her savings. He asked her to withdraw money from the bank, claiming he needed it for an investment. He spoke of selling her jewelry for the future. When she hesitated, he grew sharp, then softened again, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. One evening, she told her cousin she had noticed a bitter taste in her tea. Her cousin laughed, dismissing it as too much sugar burned on the stove. Marie laughed too. Bu unésili. The thought did not leave her. And then came the night when her stomach twisted like a knot. She doubled over, gasping, her skin clammy with sweat. She tried to pray, but the words faltered between retches. The landlady wanted to summon the doctor immediately, but Schmidt assured her it was only a passing sickness. She ate something bad, he said calmly, folding his newspaper while Marie writhed in pain. By morning, her voice was gone, her body slack. She died without answers. Her dreams dissolved into silence. Her funeral was small, hurried. The priest spoke of God's mysterious ways. The landlady noticed Schmidt did not weep. His eyes were dry, his posture straight. He carried himself not like a grieving husband, but like a man waiting for a train. And indeed, he was. That night, he vanished, with Marie's savings, leaving behind only the marriage license in the drawer, his name written boldly in ink that already began to blur at the edges. The tragedy of Marie's life was not hers alone. She was one among many, though she never knew it. In Racine, a widow named Bertha had written similar letters to a man calling himself Henry Bartels. She too dreamed of companionship. She too died with the same violent sickness. In Cincinnati, a seamstress named Emma saved Hoch's letters in a small wooden box, believing them to be her doorway to a better life. Her story ended in the same way: marriage, illness, death. Each woman believed she had found salvation in the personal ads. Each one was drawn into the same pattern. Their dreams became their downfall. For detectives like George Shippey, piecing together these stories would take time. But for now, all that remained in Marie's room were her letters, ribbons frayed, ink fading, promises poisonnées. The first time Detective George Shippey heard the name John Schmidt, it meant little. Schmidt was as common among Chicago's German immigrants as Smith or Jones. But when the same name appeared on 3 different marriage licenses in 3 different counties, each followed by a widow's sudden death, Shippey's instincts sharpened. It was the pattern that disturbed him. The police had been called to the boarding house after Marie Walker's death, only to find her husband vanished. Nothing unusual. They muttered men skipped town all the time, especially when bills came due. But a clerk at the Cook County Marriage Bureau, curious, mentioned something odd. This Schmidt had married another woman, under the name Bartels, only months earlier. That wife had died. 2. Shippey began pulling records, scouring ledgers with ink-stained fingers. He laid the documents side by side. The names differed, but the handwriting whispered the truth. The loop of the J, the flourish on the T, they matched. One man, many brides. Meanwhile, letters poured into the Chicago Tribune. Families wrote of sisters and cousins who had married a mysterious suitor, only to die of stomach convulsions days later. A widow from Racine described how her sister Bertha had fallen in love with a man calling himself Henry Bartels. He charmed her, the letter read, and she trusted him. Within a week, she was gone. Her savings with him. The newspaper smelled a story. Reporters compiled the accounts. Tracing the man's path across the Midwest, they pinned it to maps, the red ink marking towns like bullet wounds. Chicago, Milwaukee, Racine, Cincinnati, St. Louis. In each city, the same sequence repeated: courtship, marriage, illness, death. One reporter muttered, "He's not just a swindler. He's a Bluebeard." The nickname stuck. The next morning, the headline read, "The Chicago Bluebeard strikes again." For widows who read the matrimonial ads with hope, the words were like ice in the veins. Was the man writing to them a suitor or a killer? Shippy pursued the trail with growing obsession. He visited boarding houses, interviewing landladies who recalled a polite man who always insisted on preparing his wife's tea himself. He spoke with bankers who remembered husbands withdrawing their new wives' accounts in cash, their explanations thin. He tracked pawn tickets for women's rings sold by men with German accents. Each story added a piece to the puzzle, but the puzzle seemed endless. Hoch, though Shippy did not yet know his true name, changed identities with ease. He could be Jacob Huff in Cincinnati, Joseph Hoch in St. Louis, John Schmidt in Chicago. He carried forged documents, adjusted his age at will, and wore the ordinariness of his appearance like armor. False leads abounded. In Milwaukee, police arrested a man named John Schmidt who matched the description, only to find he was a harmless carpenter. In Aurora, a farmer was accused of being the Bluebeard, until his alibi proved airtight. Each misstep gave the real killer time to move again, to vanish onto a train and reappear in another town with another bride. Still, whispers gathered momentum. Families of the dead began to write to each other, trading suspicions. A sister in Chicago discovered that her cousin in Cincinnati had lost her life in the same way, to a man who looked eerily familiar. They pressed local authorities, demanding answers. One detail gnawed at Shippy: the cause of death listed in nearly every case: acute gastritis. It was too neat, too convenient. Doctors, overworked and undertrained in toxicology, had signed the certificates quickly. But what if these deaths were not natural? What if a hand had guided them, dosing meals with something unseen? That possibility poison was almost unthinkable. In the public mind, poisoning was the crime of jealous wives, not of husbands. But Hoch, whoever he was, had inverted the script. He turned matrimony into murder. By late 1904, Shippy had enough fragments to be sure. One man, dozens of wives, countless graves, yet proving it was another matter, without exhumations, without chemical tests. Suspicion remained only that the press, however, needed no proof. They painted the Bluebeard as a phantom drifting across the Midwest, marrying for money and leaving corpses in his wake. The public devoured the stories, each headline ratcheting up the fear. In boarding houses, women clutched their letters tighter, wondering if their suitor was the man in the papers. Meanwhile, the killer himself read those very headlines. He folded the newspapers neatly, smiled faintly, and moved on to his next ad. His next bride. He knew the law was clumsy, slow, divided by state lines. He knew suspicion was not enough to hang a man. And for now, suspicion was all they had. The presses thundered through the night. By dawn, Chicago awoke to black letters screaming across every newsstand. The Chicago Bluebeard. The name carried weight. Borrowed from the old French folktale, but sharpened now with American fear. This was not a fairy tale. This was a man moving among them, boarding streetcars, tipping his hat to widows, shaking hands in church while leaving behind a trail of poisoned wives. The newspapers devoured every detail, some true, many embellished. One account claimed he carried a little black satchel filled with arsenic packets. Another, that he carved notches into his walking stick for every bride he buried. Editors knew sensationalism sold, and the city was hungry for horror. Women who once clipped matrimonial ads now clipped Bluebeard headlines, reading them with trembling fingers. Matrimonial agencies reported a sharp decline in letters. No woman dares trust a stranger now. One agency clerk told the Tribune. Boarding houses buzzed with rumor. Did you hear? He was last seen in Milwaukee. No. Cincinnati. No. Right here in Chicago, wearing a gray hat. The fear was not confined to the city. Rural towns, connected by rail and gossip, felt his shadow as well. In Racine, a widow locked her letters in a drawer, refusing to answer them. In Cincinnati, seamstresses whispered that every German lodger might be the Bluebeard. In Aurora, children taunted each other with a rhyme. Bluebeard comes to take a bride. Arsenic his groom's delight. For the police, the frenzy was both help and hindrance. Reports flooded in. Sightings of men with mustaches. Suspicions of husbands who remarried too quickly. Accusations against harmless boarders. One detective grumbled. Half the city thinks their neighbor is Bluebeard? But within the noise, real leads emerged. A pawnbroker described a man selling a wedding ring days after his wife's death. A chemist recalled selling arsenic to a customer who claimed it was for killing rats. Each tip narrowed the circle. Detective George Shippey worked tirelessly, his desk buried in clippings and marriage records. He followed the paper trail, alias by alias, city by city. He saw the rhythm clearly now. A man marrying women, draining their accounts, then leaving them to die. It was not chance. It was design. Still, the killer remained elusive. He was ordinary, almost invisible. Witnesses struggled to describe him beyond medium height, thinning hair, mustache. He could be any man on the streetcar, any boarder with rent paid in advance. That was the genius of his disguise. Anonymity as weapon. In the taverns, men debated the story with whiskey-soaked bravado. Some cursed the killer as a coward who preyed on women. Others smirked that the victims were foolish, desperate for marriage. Beneath the jokes lay unease. The Bluebeard had exposed a raw truth. In a city where loneliness gnawed like hunger, even death could wear the mask of love. Clergymen thundered from pulpits, warning women against hasty unions and the devil's advertisements of matrimonial columns. One preacher declared, "Better to live alone in God's grace than to wed a stranger who brings only the grave." But fear alone did not slow him. Even as headlines screamed his name, the Bluebeard continued to place ads under fresh aliases. He knew the hysteria worked in his favor. The more sightings, the more confusion. While police chased phantoms, he courted his next victim. A chilling discovery pushed panic into overdrive. In Milwaukee, the family of a dead bride demanded an exhumation. When doctors opened her coffin, the smell of chemicals rose from the earth. Tests revealed arsenic in her stomach crystals that glittered like frost beneath the microscope. The suspicion was confirmed. The Bluebeard was not a swindler who abandoned his wives. He was a poisoner who murdered them. The newspapers pounced. Arsenic Bluebeard blazed across front pages. Reporters counted his marriages 10, 20, 30 each article, inflating the number. One paper claimed 50 brides, another 70. The truth was murky, but the effect undeniable. The man had become legend even before capture. Women carried the papers folded in their handbags, pointing to the woodcut illustrations of his face. "If he knocks on my door, I'll know him," they swore. But the drawings, copied from grainy photographs, showed only a forgettable man with a mustache. No different from half the husbands in Chicago. By the winter of 1904, the fear was so palpable that it shaped behavior. Boarding house landladies refused new German boarders without references. Banks grew wary of husbands demanding sudden withdrawals. Some women placed matrimonial ads of their own warning, "No correspondence with strangers. Bluebeard is abroad." But the killer did not stop. He could not stop. The cycle of marriage and death had become his rhythm, his compulsion. And now, under the weight of fame, he made his first mistakes. He reused an alias. He signed a ledger with handwriting too familiar. He lingered too long in one city. For Detective Shippey, the chase was narrowing. The public hysteria, for all its noise, had flushed the Bluebeard into view. And soon, Shippey would catch his scent. The story of Johann Otto Hoch did not begin with arsenic in a boarding house teacup. It began far earlier in a small village in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, where the Rhine cut through farmland and boys were raised on hard work and harder rules. Born in 1855, he was Johann Schmidt then, son of a carpenter, grandson of peasants. Neighbors remembered a restless child. He was clever with words, less so with wood. He borrowed coins from friends and forgot to repay them. He charmed teachers with smiles, then lied about his lessons. Dishonesty came easily, not as rebellion, but as reflex. By his 20s, he had already shown a pattern. He married a young woman in his village, then abandoned her within months, vanishing with her dowry. There were whispers of thefts, of schemes, too small to bring police, but large enough to breed suspicion. Rather than face disgrace, Johann disappeared boarding a ship west, part of the tide of German immigrants flooding America in the 1,880 seconds. In America, he found freedom in anonymity. New York's docks were swollen with men who spoke his language. From there, he drifted inland, where Chicago's booming stockyards devoured laborers by the thousands. Here, a man could reinvent himself as easily as changing his hat. And Johann was a master of reinvention. He became John Schmidt, then Henry Bartels, then Jacob Huff. Names slid from him like discarded skins. He understood that in a nation still stitching together its bureaucracy, records could not keep pace with human movement. Marry in Illinois under one name, remarry in Wisconsin under another, and no one compared notes. He did not crave romance, he craved advantage. But to achieve it, he needed to perfect the performance of love. He learned to listen with a tilted head, to mirror a widow's longing back at her with practiced sincerity. He discovered the power of touch, gentle handshakes, reassuring pats that suggested reliability, and above all, he wielded his ordinariness like a weapon. Average height, thinning hair, neat mustache, unremarkable, forgettable. In a crowd of immigrants, he blended until he vanished. Why poison? Historians would debate this long after his hanging. Arsenic was common then, sold cheaply in chemists' shops as rat killer. A packet cost mere pennies, enough to erase a life. For Hoch, it was ideal, invisible, easy to administer, slow enough to mimic natural illness. Women collapsed in agony. Doctors scribbled gastritis or typhoid, and suspicion moved on. But money alone cannot explain his cycle. Yes, he drained accounts and pawned rings, but then he repeated it over and over. Courtship, marriage, illness, death, more than 50 times. The compulsion suggested something deeper, a hunger for control. Perhaps even a thrill in watching trust curdle into terror. Psychologists today might call it pathological compulsion. A man addicted not to profit, but to the ritual itself. Each new wife was both camouflage and conquest. Each vow at the altar was another layer of protection. Society's blessing cloaking his crimes. To Hoch, marriage was not sacred. It was a transaction, a performance, a stage upon which he was always the lead actor until the curtain fell in the form of a coffin. In private, glimpses of cruelty broke through the mask. Survivors, rare women who escaped him, described sudden flashes of coldness when money was mentioned. One recalled how he demanded she surrender her savings, his eyes narrowing when she hesitated. Another told of pouring a bitter-tasting tea into a plant instead of drinking it. The plant withered within days. These slips revealed the predator beneath the gentleman's veneer. But to most, he appeared steady, respectable. That was his genius. He did not frighten his victims. He comforted them, right up until the moment he placed death in their cups. By 1904, his trail stretched across the Midwest like a scar. Chicago, Milwaukee, Racine, Cincinnati, St. Louis. Dozens of women, some swindled, many buried. The exact number of his victims was lost in the gaps of state lines and hasty death certificates. But the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Johann Otto Hoch traveled, the ground seemed to rise with new graves, and perhaps the man himself began to believe the myth. The newspapers called him the Chicago Bluebeard, painting him as a phantom, a figure from nightmare. He read the headlines, smiled faintly, and folded the paper away. The fear he inspired was useful. It cloaked him in legend, while the real man slipped unnoticed onto the next train. But legends cut both ways. The louder the press shouted his name, the closer detectives drew. His ordinariness, once his greatest weapon, became a description on wanted posters. His aliases, once shields, began to blur together. He was no longer vanishing as easily as before. The hunter was closing in. The shovel struck wood with a hollow thud. It was autumn. 1904. In Milwaukee's Forest Home Cemetery, and a small crowd had gathered behind the coroner's men. The grave was being opened at the insistence of a grieving family. Bertha's family, who could not shake the suspicion that her new husband had not been the grieving widower he appeared to be. The lid was pried back. Gas hissed from the coffin, the odor sour and chemical. Bertha's body lay stiff, her dress mottled, her skin pale as chalk. But what interested the coroner were not the sights or smells of decay. It was what lingered inside her stomach. They took samples to the laboratory. Days later, under the microscope, the crystals sparkled. Arsenic. Enough to kill swiftly. Enough to mimic gastritis or cholera. Enough to convince any busy doctor that her death was natural. For the first time, suspicion had become proof. Detective George Shippey read the report in silence. His instincts had been right all along. The women were not dying by chance. They were being murdered. And not by some shadowy stranger, by the very man they trusted most. The one they called husband. The revelation electrified the press. "Arsenic Bluebeard," screamed the Tribune. "He murders his brides with poison." The public, already consumed with fear, now felt vindicated in their dread. The killer wasn't a simple swindler. He was a poisoner, a methodical murderer, with science on his side. And worse, he could be anywhere. Women folded the papers in trembling hands. Some tore up their correspondence with suitors they had never met. Others carried the illustrations of his face in their handbags, studying them with a kind of morbid devotion. But the sketches, grainy, indistinct, showed a man so ordinary, he might be anyone in the crowd. The forensic breakthrough also meant pressure. Coroners in other towns now faced demands for exhumations. Families who had buried sisters or daughters after sudden illnesses demanded answers. In Racine, in Cincinnati, in Aurora, graves were reopened, stomachs tested, and the results whispered the same truth. Arsenic, gleaming like frost. The pattern was undeniable, but building a case was maddeningly difficult. Each death occurred in a different jurisdiction, under a different name. Prosecutors demanded more than suspicion. They needed a body, a clear trail, a living witness. And Hoch, if Hoch was his true name, always vanished before questions sharpened. Meanwhile, the killer himself kept moving. He read the headlines with an odd detachment, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning. Did he fear discovery? Or did he thrill at the myth growing around him? The papers said he had 50 brides, perhaps 70. They were guessing, but the number hardly mattered. What mattered was the legend. Bluebeard had become America's bogeyman. And legends, he knew, were harder to catch than men. Still, mistakes crept in, flush with confidence. He courted too quickly. Reusing aliases, he thought forgotten. He left behind inconsistent signatures in hotel registers. He grew careless with his exits, lingering a day too long in one town, trusting his luck to cover his tracks. The net was tightening. Detectives pieced together fragments with mounting excitement. Bank clerks recalled husbands withdrawing wives' savings hours before their deaths. Pawnbrokers produced records of rings sold by men matching his description. Matrimonial ads in the Daily News carried replies in handwriting, eerily similar to that of marriage records. Shippey compiled these scraps into a crude map of terror. Pins stuck across the Midwest, each marking a bride, a grave, a theft. The scope stunned even hardened officers. This was not the work of a casual poisoner. This was systematic, almost industrial. And then came the greatest revelation yet. Johann Otto Hoch. His true name surfaced in Chicago records, buried beneath his aliases. With it came a traceable history immigration from Germany. Early frauds. A string of abandoned wives. For the first time, the phantom had a face. A bust. A name that did not shift with every train ride. But proof was still fragile. Courts demanded evidence that would hold brutalizine, not whispers from grieving families. And so the exhumations continued. Spades, tearing open coffins. Stomachs tested. Arsenic revealed again and again. Each test was a drumbeat, a cadence of guilt. Still, the man himself remained free. He walked the streets while his victims' bodies were pulled from the earth. He tipped his hat to strangers while coroners scraped glittering poison from corpses. He wrote love letters while headlines branded him a monster. The irony was unbearable. The killer was alive, smiling, courting, while the dead were disturbed to prove what everyone already knew. By late 1904, warrants were issued, rewards offered, posters printed with his likeness plastered taverns, train depots, and post offices. Wanted, Johann Otto Hoch, alias Schmidt, Bartels, Hof, for bigamy, swindling, and murder. Yet the man who had reinvented himself 100 times was not easy to pin down. For every sighting that seemed solid, 2 others contradicted it. He was in St. Louis one week, Cincinnati the next. Each tip sent police chasing shadows, while the real man slipped further into the fog. But the arsenic had changed everything. The science was irrefutable. The law now had a weapon sharper than rumor. And soon, Hoch would discover that arsenic, once his ally, had become the key to his downfall. The room fell silent when Detective Shippey dropped the stack of licenses onto the table. It was early 1905, and the Chicago Police Bureau smelled of coal smoke and sweat. Reporters crowded outside the door, demanding numbers. How many women had this so-called Bluebeard married? How many had he buried? Shippey spread the papers like cards in a gambler's hand. Cook County, Lake County, Racine, Cincinnati, St. Louis. Each bore a name: Schmidt, Bartels, Hoff, Hoch, but the handwriting tied them together like a noose. The tally was staggering. Not 3 or 4 wives, not a dozen, but dozens, perhaps 50, some still alive, abandoned and penniless. Others lying in graves labeled acute gastritis. The sheer scale bent belief. America had seen killers before, but none who turned marriage itself into a production line of death. The press seized the revelation with ferocity. Headlines shrieked, "Bluebeard's 50 brides, women poisoned for their savings." How many graves bear his name? Illustrations showed rows of women in wedding gowns fading into tombstones. Cartoonists sketched him with a satchel of arsenic packets, scattering them like confetti at the altar. Public hysteria reached a fever pitch. Women refused proposals from suitors they had known for months. Matrimonial agencies shuddered under pressure. Even innocent German bachelors found themselves eyed with suspicion. The mythology grew faster than the facts. Some papers claimed Hoch had married 70 women, others 90. One article suggested he had brides in every major city from New York to San Francisco. The truth was elusive, records incomplete, names false, deaths buried in routine. But the exaggerations mattered less than the terror they inspired. The very institution of marriage sacred. Stabilizing had been turned into a killing ground. For investigators, the twist was double-edged. The scale proved his monstrosity, but it also made prosecution difficult. Which case to bring first? Which body to exhume? Which alias to charge? Jurisdictions argued, each state eager to hang him for their own dead. Meanwhile, lawyers warned that bigamy, swindling, and fraud, though abundant, carried lighter sentences than murder. Without airtight proof, Bluebeard might escape the gallows. Families of the victims howled for justice. Letters poured into police stations. Sisters demanding recognition for their lost siblings. Parents begging for graves to be tested. Cousins describing eerily similar illnesses. Each letter was a wound reopened. Each begged the same question. Why wasn't he stopped sooner? And through it all, Hoch kept moving. He was still writing letters, still answering ads. In one city, he was Jacob Huff, promising a life of comfort to a seamstress. In another, Henry Bartels, courting a widow who kept her savings in a trunk beneath her bed. He moved with a traveler's efficiency, folding his past into his satchel, leaving only graves behind. But fame had altered the game. Every paper carried his face now, every alias tied to his name. His ordinariness, once his shield, became a curse. Landladies looked twice at borders. Bank clerks lingered on his accent. Train conductors studied his tickets. He was still invisible in crowds, but less so than before. The myth that protected him now betrayed him. The real twist, though, was psychological. This was not simply greed. If it had been, he might have stopped after the first fortune, lived quietly, faded into obscurity. But Hoch did not stop. He multiplied his wives, repeated his cycle, as if compelled by a force beyond profit. Each marriage was both mask and ritual. Each death reaffirmed his power. Some criminologists would later describe him as the prototype of the compulsive bigamist murderer, a man addicted to the ceremony of deception, who drew satisfaction not merely from money, but from the performance of trust betrayed. The nickname Bluebeard fit too well. Like the folktale, he collected wives not as partners, but as victims. Their futures locked in the silent chamber of graves scattered across the Midwest. By winter's end, the case had swelled into national scandal. Editorials thundered about the dangers of matrimonial ads, the vulnerability of women, the failure of law enforcement to track criminals across state lines. Politicians promised reform. Preachers used Hoch as a cautionary tale, a monster to frighten congregations into moral vigilance. But beneath the moralizing, a deeper unease spread. If a man so ordinary could conceal dozens of crimes, what did that say about the city itself? About the cracks in modern life, where loneliness could be weaponized and love poisoned at the altar. The police now knew the scope. The public now knew the name. And Johann Otto Hoch, the man of 50 wives, was closer than anyone realized. The snow fell thick over Chicago. January 1905, muting the rattle of streetcars and the cries of newsboys hawking headlines. But in one narrow street, the hush broke with the sound of boots crunching toward a boarding house. Inside, behind thin curtains, a man warmed his hands over a coal stove, confident that once again he had outrun suspicion. His name on the register was Joseph Hoch. To the landlady, he was a widower, polite, sober, eager for companionship. To his new bride, a woman named Caroline, he was security at last. The promise of protection against the chill of loneliness. He smiled gently at her, stroked her hand, and spoke of a future together. But detectives were already circling. The hunt had intensified after Marie Walker's death. Witnesses linked Hoch to multiple marriages, multiple funerals, his photograph-thin hair, mustache, dark eyes was plastered in post offices and taverns. Every day, new letters poured in. Women across the Midwest swearing they had met him, some barely escaping his charm. The web had narrowed until Chicago itself seemed to breathe his name. Detective George Shippey received a tip from a boarding house maid who thought the tenant looked like the man in the papers. Shippey moved swiftly. This time there would be no mistake. On the night of the arrest, officers interred quietly, their breath fogging in the cold. Hoch sat at a table writing letters, his satchel beside him. He looked up, startled, as the door burst open. For a moment, the room froze, the killer and the men who had hunted him staring across a gulf of silence. Then Shippey stepped forward. "Johann Otto Hoch," he said evenly, "you are under arrest." The man blinked, as though weighing which name to choose. His lips parted, but no words came. Then he sighed, folded his hands neatly on the table, and allowed the cuffs to close around his wrists. It was shockingly anticlimactic. The monster of headlines, the phantom of 50 wives, subdued like a clerk caught embezzling. He did not resist. He did not rage. He simply yielded, eyes flickering with calculation, as though already plotting the next mask he might wear. The satchel told its own story. Inside were letters from matrimonial agencies, neatly bundled, drafts of replies, promises of love scrawled in careful script, a marriage license application half-filled, waiting for the name of his next bride. And, at the bottom, a small paper packet of white powder. The lab confirmed what everyone feared: arsenic. News of the arrest spread faster than the snowstorm. Crowds gathered outside the jail, straining for a glimpse of the Bluebeard. Women spat curses, men shouted for the rope. Newspaper boys shouted until their voices cracked. "Bluebeard captured." Inside, Hoch maintained a calm facade. He denied nothing, but confessed nothing. He spoke politely to guards, asked for newspapers, and read reports of his own crimes with faint amusement. To one reporter, he remarked, "They exaggerate. I am not so wicked as they say." Huh. But behind the mask, cracks showed. When confronted with the letters from his satchel, he paled. When told of the arsenic crystals found in Bertha's grave, he looked away. And when Caroline, his latest wife, was brought to testify, he grew visibly agitated, hands clenching on the rail. For her, it was a narrow escape. Had the police waited days longer, she might have been another body in the ground. The arrest did not end the fear, it intensified it. With Hoch in custody, women across the Midwest stepped forward, recounting eerie encounters. Some had married him and survived. Others had broken off engagements after uneasy discoveries. One woman confessed she had once tasted bitterness in her tea, but poured it out instead. The scale of his predation was overwhelming. Prosecutors argued over jurisdiction. Which bride's death should be tried first? Which city had the strongest evidence? Hoch sat silently through the debates, his gaze distant, as if he were already elsewhere. The confrontation had ended in capture, but the battle for justice was only beginning. To hang him, prosecutors needed more than myth. They needed a single case that would withstand every challenge, every trick. And Hoch? though shackled, still believed he could talk his way free. The courtroom reeked of sweat, ink, and damp wool coats. Every seat was filled, the aisles crammed with reporters sharpening their pencils, sketch artists jostling for angles, widows clutching handkerchiefs like weapons. Outside, a crowd pressed against the courthouse doors, shouting for justice. January 1906. The trial of Johann Otto Hoch had begun. He entered with surprising composure, shackled wrists, plain suit, neatly trimmed mustache. He looked more like a grocer dragged in for unpaid debts than a man accused of poisoning dozens of wives. The ordinariness was unnerving, so much so that a reporter whispered, "He could pass me in the street, and I'd never know." But the women knew. Survivors sat in the gallery, eyes locked on him with fury and disbelief. One muttered, "That's him. That's the devil." The prosecution focused on a single case, Bertha, the Milwaukee bride, exhumed to reveal arsenic in her stomach. It was the clearest evidence, the strongest chance to secure a conviction. Witnesses paraded forward. The chemist who had sold Hoch arsenic under the pretense of killing rats, the banker who watched him drain Bertha's account, the coroner who described crystals glittering under the microscope. Each detail tightened the noose. Then came Caroline, his most recent wife, who had barely escaped becoming another victim. She testified how he had courted her, pressed for quick marriage, and urged her to hand over her savings. She described his calmness when she grew ill, how he insisted on preparing her tea himself. The courtroom shivered at her words. The defense countered with thin arguments. They claimed Bertha had ingested arsenic accidentally, that it was common in household products. They painted Hoch as a misunderstood immigrant, hounded by sensationalist newspapers. His lawyer thundered against the nickname Bluebeard, calling it a fairy tale smear, unfit for serious justice. But the jury's eyes told another story. They had read the headlines. They had seen the map of his marriages, the list of names, the faces of grieving families. The myth had already become truth in the public mind. Through it all, Hoch remained eerily calm, had denied little, admitted less. When asked directly about Bertha, he shrugged. "She was sick. I tried to help her." When pressed about arsenic, he smiled faintly. "A man needs to kill rats. Does he not?" The spectators hissed. One widow shouted, "Murderer!" before being silenced by the judge's gavel. Reporters devoured every moment. Papers described him as a monster in human form, a ghoul of matrimony. They painted Caroline as the almost victim who cheated death, the heroine who lived to tell her tale. Editorials demanded swift hanging. The jury deliberated less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman's voice rang steady, "Guilty of murder." The sentence was death by hanging. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted cheers, sobs, applause. Reporters scrambled for telegraphs. Outside, the crowd roared, chanting, "Hung Bluebeard, hung him." And Hoch? He simply nodded, as though acknowledging a minor inconvenience. Later, in his cell, he told a reporter, "I am not afraid. They exaggerate. I am not as wicked as they say." Even with the gallows built, he believed he could charm his way free. In the weeks before execution, he wrote letters to newspapers protesting his innocence, to women, astonishingly, seeking sympathy. Incredibly, one woman stranger to him sent money to aid his appeal. Even in chains, his manipulations worked. The governor denied clemency. Appeals failed. The date was set, the 23rd of February, 1906. On the eve of death, he ate heartily sausage, bread, to beer. Reporters noted his appetite with morbid fascination. A man who devours food so close to the rope, one wrote, must be either fearless or soulless. The morning of execution dawned gray. Crowds gathered outside the Cook County Jail, shivering in the cold. Inside, priests prayed. Guards adjusted ropes. Hoch, dressed in his plain suit, still carrying himself like a man, certain of his own importance, asked for final words. He declared, I am innocent of murder. He paused, then added, I have been married many times. Yes, but never did I kill. The trapdoor opened. The ropes snapped tight, and the Chicago Bluebeard swung into history. The gallows had done its work, but the story refused to end. In the weeks after Johann Otto Hoch's execution on the 23rd of February, 1906, the newspapers did not let him die. Instead, they resurrected him in headline after headline, each one probing, counting, retelling. The number of his wives swelled in print. Some said 40, others 50, still others, nearly 100. The exact figure was lost in the fog of aliases and state lines. But the exaggeration mattered less than the unease it left behind. Families kept coming forward. In Milwaukee, a sister wrote to the coroner, demanding her sibling's grave be tested. In Cincinnati, a cousin recounted how a bride had wasted away in 3 days, just like the others. In Aurora, a landlady remembered a tenant who signed 2 names in her guest book. Both now familiar from the papers, each new revelation was like a voice from the grave, whispering, "He touched my life." 2. The victims did not rest easily in memory. Their names filled columns: Bertha, Marie, Emma, Anna. For each, the newspapers reconstructed lives that once held promise. A seamstress with dreams of a shop, a widow hoping for companionship, a young woman saving for a small home. Their hopes, their letters, their laughter all swallowed by the ritual of arsenic. To the public, Hoch became less a man than a symbol. He was proof that evil could hide behind ordinariness, that a wedding vow could mask a death sentence. The nickname Chicago Bluebeard hardened into myth. Children recited rhymes about him. Preachers thundered his tale as warning. Women eyed matrimonial ads with suspicion. Love itself, once sacred, now carried a shadow. But there was another echo. The failure of the system. Detectives admitted, bitterly, that Hoch had flourished because states did not share records. A man could marry in Illinois on Monday and in Wisconsin on Friday, and no clerk would ever know. Doctors had scrawled gastritis on death certificates without testing further. Banks had handed over widows' savings to men who claimed to be husbands. New questions asked. It was not just Hoch who killed it. Was the gaps, the silences, the complacency of a young nation. He had weaponized the very anonymity America offered immigrants, slipping between jurisdictions like smoke. Even after his body was buried in Potter's Field, rumeur persisted. Some whispered he had confessed secretly to dozens more murders. Others insisted he had accomplices, perhaps women who helped him lure victims. A few conspiracy-minded writers claimed the man hanged was not Hoch at all, that he had bribed his way to freedom, leaving a double in his place. None of it was true, but the uncertainty was enough. Legends do not require proof, they require only hunger. And America was hungry for the story of a man who collected wives and left behind graves. Modern criminologists would later look back and call him one of the earliest examples of a compulsive bigamist killer. He was not the first poisoner, nor the last, but the scale of his deception set him apart. He proved that murder need not be committed in alleys with knives. It could be committed at the altar, beneath stained glass, with vows whispered as arsenic dissolved in tea. His story echoes even now. In every scam that preys on loneliness, every predator who cloaks harm in the promise of love, dating ads, online profiles, even the glow of modern screens, they all carry the faint ghost of Bluebeard, reminding us how easily trust can be poisoned. In the end, Hoch left behind no great fortune, no hidden trove of jewels. His legacy was emptier, crueler, a string of women whose futures ended in silence, and a society forced to confront its own blindness. The letters he wrote, those bland, affectionate lines promising companionship, became epitaphs for the women who believed them. One of Marie Walker's surviving cousins kept her bundle of letters until her death. The ink faded, the paper frayed, but the words remained. We will build a life together, safe and happy. When the letters were read decades later, they carried the chill of prophecy. Love transformed into a death warrant. And so the story circles back to the boarding house. The smell of sickness, the glass with its milky film, a detail small enough to ignore, yet large enough to unravel the mask. That glass, like the ribbon-tied letters, remains the symbol of a crime that turned ordinary objects into instruments of betrayal. The Chicago Bluebeard swung from the rope, but his echo lingers, reminding us that monsters do not always come with knives or in shadows. Sometimes they arrive with flowers, a ring, and a promise.